안녕하세요, 여러분. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Reality Project Bay Area Chapter Indigenous Voices Speaker Series. We have the privilege today of being here with Michelle Robinson, who is Sahtu Dene. She is the host of the Native Calgarian podcast and book club, former geomatic drafter for an oil and gas company, and she will discuss crucial topics for settlers like us who are climate activists. The title of this program is Canadian Tar Sands and Indigenous Resistance, Reckoning and Renewal. Before we turn it over, I just want to acknowledge that I am heralding from the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone in San Francisco, California. And to remind folks that Indigenous people consist of less than 5% of the world population, but protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, according to National Geographic. And there was a really excellent book and pamphlet that came out in 2021 called Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon that talked about efforts in the US and Canada that have kept billions of tons of carbon in the ground, equivalent to 1/4 the annual emissions of US and Canada combined. So it's become very, very clear since we started the Indigenous Voices Speaker Series and Indigenous Voices Project 3 years ago that protecting Indigenous rights and listening to Indigenous people was crucial in the effort to end the global climate crisis. And so thank you for joining us. Thank you, Michelle, for taking the time to be with us today. And we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Oki Naganago Mekoche Chestakom Aki. In Blackfoot, I tried to say my name is Red Thunder Woman. And in my language, I say Dakota Nagot Tine Siku. And for me, it matters a lot to introduce yourself because the first thing I'm acknowledging is the land I'm on and the language on the land. And then when I say it in my language, I'm acknowledging my own ancestors, which I don't think a lot of people will understand after the Indian boarding schools that you've had in the States and the Indian residential schools that we had up here. It is really hard for us to basically have to relearn who we are, learn our customs, and learn our language. So it's actually taken me years to be able to introduce myself both in Blackfoot and in Sahtu Dene as a result of colonization. And the other part was identity. As an Indigenous person, it was really hard to identify as anything other than what my Indian Act status card told me to. And I didn't know I was Sahtu Dene. I just thought I was Yellow Knives Dene because that's what my Canadian Indian Act imposed status card said. So, yeah, I guess we'll start there and just say thank you to all of you for having me, but also Siri for inviting me and for all the great tech work that's being done behind the scenes as well. I really appreciate that so it can just focus on what it is I'm talking about. And I also like to acknowledge that Two-Spirit were here first. And for those who don't know, Two-Spirit are the original lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folks that you would say. And Two-Spirit was an English term that was recently invented to try to talk about Indigenous concepts of gender diversity. And each nation, which there are hundreds of, has their own way to say what they are in their role in their community. So anyway, I use she and her pronouns, but I want to acknowledge that we had to invent he and she in our language in order to accommodate the newcomers and the new settlers who use this purposeful binary on our people and on everyone. And so I always say that they forced the straight Christian agenda on these lands because that is true. That is what happened. So, yeah, a little bit about me.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So let's go ahead and start with our first question about Canadian fossil fuel extraction and how it's connected to the United States and the rest of the world, and what can settler climate activists like us do to support Indigenous resistance against carbon?
Okay. So originally, I should start by saying I'm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So a lot of people call that Texas North. So we have a lot of the U.S. oil companies that are up here in Canada and the energy companies in Canada. And because of Canadian laws and the way they are a little more lax, we actually have a lot of head offices here that are working globally. And so I do find it ironic when people say Canadian made, because the truth is that it's the Canadian branch of an American oil company, usually, that is here. And sometimes it's from other countries as well. So very rarely does any of the resources that are pumped from here stay here. The profits are not necessarily going here. They're going to the parent company, which is usually out of the country. So it's interesting being in a settler colonial state where I see that, but Canadians, my average Canadian would not see that. They would just be like, oh, what I work for, Ancana, and don't see the correlation to the monies going to American profiteering. So there's like, let's start there. I'm just going to go back to the question because to me, it's a really complex question to answer. And the other part is, so because a lot of our American counterparts are in the States, there aren't actually the same amount of refineries that are in Canada that are in the States. So a lot of our bitumen, which you would call tar sands, that is just pumped right into the States for it to be extracted there, which is ridiculous. But that is what we do. So a lot of Canadian workers say, why are we not building refineries here to process the bitumen here? So that way we can, have a few different levels, a few different points of us making some kind of profit and Canadian workers, of course, benefiting from that. But we don't do that because it's technically an American decision that happens a lot of the time in Texas. And what can settler climate activists do to support Indigenous resistance? That's a bit of a loaded question because I find that I can tell a lot by a land acknowledgement where a settler is on their understanding of where we really are. And I don't think that the average American or the average Canadian settler understand they are still committing genocide on Indigenous people on stolen land. So if settlers did understand that, that would be the start of where we can even begin the conversation. So, for example, there's something called the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. The US, Canada, Australia, these were the types of countries that were like the last to sign on to it because technically they are a settler colonizing state. And most Americans would not understand that. Most Canadians don't understand that. And of course, most Australians wouldn't understand that. But the Indigenous people in all of those countries sure know. So let's start there. Here in Canada, in order to even have a Canadian Constitution, they had to have the Indian Act. And so the Indian Act is embedded in our Canadian Constitution, and it is a form of oppression. So today, because I qualify under that, I'm considered a ward of the state. So I don't have the same rights and freedoms and anonymity that a regular citizen would have. And I think that is something that most Americans and Canadians would not understand, is that we don't have the same freedoms that a regular person, a regular citizen would have. And Siri wrote in the chat there, because I do like to say UNDRIP when talking about the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because I'm lazy and would rather say UNDRIP. But at the end of the day, that's a really clear document. It has 43 articles in it that really talk about Indigenous governance. So as Americans, I want you to imagine the American Constitution being thrown out and you are no longer considered American citizens. I want you to consider being, you did a land acknowledgement, being citizens under that nation and listening to the Indigenous people of that nation who would normally govern this land, you being a citizen under their world. That would be an understanding of that settler colonialism to start with. Now, we're nowhere there. I think that Americans would lose their nut if somebody said we're throwing out the American Constitution. Conversely, so would Canadians. If we said the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we're no longer going to follow that, or the Constitution Act, we're not going to follow that. So Canadians would lose it too. So don't feel alone. But at the end of the day, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is supposed to allow and self-determination. So I hope you can understand that there's a conflict already there, right? Because you have settlers and colonizers who want to profit and steal the land. And then you have Indigenous people that are like, no, but if you want to live because of climate change, you should probably listen to us. So we already have that. And we've already have a governance system of oppression on Indigenous people. So Indigenous people are already advocating for what's the right thing to do under an immense amount of oppression. And I always talk about systemic poverty, because they created a system where we are under systemic poverty, both in the States and in Canada. So we're trying to fight oppression under the most extreme circumstances. And I think that that's not really understood. So, for example, some of the questions that were asked of me is like, why would Indigenous people possibly want to participate in mining or extraction in any capacity? Well, if you've been under systemic oppression and systemic poverty over the course of decades and now generations, and somebody said, hey, we would like to do a partnership with you, wouldn't you be kind of ridiculous to say no when you are watching your children die because of the lack of infrastructure in your community, the lack of resources, the lack of community associations, the lack of sports clubs? I mean, our children aren't even getting a proper education because we don't have enough infrastructure going towards that. We don't get dollar-to-dollar funding that a municipality or province, or in your case, state would get when it comes to, the money of taxes being paid into the Confederation of either the States or Canada, right? So those monies that would normally go into certain pockets, we get like 30% to $1 that you would get, right? So you get, say, $200 in education, we would get far less than that. We would get like $60. Right. So imagine there always being that deficit in every single part of everything, all the infrastructure, all the institutions, all the health, everything. And that was done on purpose. That was done on design. I think that many of you must be aware that many of the Black communities also are under that same systemic pressure in the States. It's not any better up here in Canada, I will tell you that. And we've also allowed a lot of new immigrants coming in from the Middle East and from India. So we have a lot of segregated areas for folks like that as well, sadly. Here in Calgary, in the Northeast, we have mainly our Brown community and a lot of the Black community. In the Southeast, a lot more of the Black community and refugees. And then Asians are pretty much everywhere. So I should say that, but just depending on where you are of class system, right? So the lower socioeconomic bracket in the city of Calgary would be the Greater Forest Lawn area, which I'm in, and a lot of the refugees, etc. So there are redlinings when it comes to the realtors about, who you are, what your socioeconomic status is, determining where it is they'd put you in the city. So a lot of people want to live in the Southwest, but, I have step family that live there, and it's getting run down, and there are a lot of at-risk communities too. So, the settler colonial expansion is not necessarily good for settlers either, but they're too blind to see it. So, so that's a little long-winded to talk about this, about how settlers can help Indigenous people. But I will say that I think we have to establish most Canadians, most Americans, they don't even see that they're a settler. And they don't see how they're extracting wealth from people that deserve equity, 1, and 2, should have consent over that, and 3, be able to govern it as well. And as you all know, there's no company shareholders that are like, yeah, we're totally going to split our profits 50-50 with the people. right? You know that. I know that. So as Indigenous people, we're that further removed from being able to get that type of equity. So I hope that helps kind of understand a little more about that. I'm just going to reread the question one more time to make sure I kind of covered some of the main points I wanted to bring up in that. Right. So in the first part of the question, it says, how does Canadian fossil fuel extraction connect to the US and the rest of the world? So I wanted my American friends here to know you shouldn't feel alone. We currently have right now a coal mining company out of Australia that wants to take apart our Rocky Mountains in order to extract the coal so that coal can be taken straight to Australia to be burned, right? And here's the irony. So a lot of the Albertans that are upset about it, they're not upset because of climate change, actually. They're upset because of the amount of water that's going to be dirtied. That's what their real issue is. So, for example, we have beer companies that are opposed to this because they want to take the water that they normally take and make good beer. The farmers want to make sure they have enough water. They've experienced multi-year drought here, so they're very concerned about the water supply. The Bow River, which is what I'm on right now, it hasn't been this low since 1913. So there's a serious issue with water being taken here. The ice caps melting, and that's the biggest source of our fresh water. It's accelerated at a rate unheard of. And we had folks from your area come up and try to tell folks about this. And I remember 10, 20 years ago, Albertans going, what do they know, stupid Americans? But the science was clear then. What was happening to the ice cap, where our freshwater reserves were going to be depleted, and now it's accelerating at an alarming rate. So, of course, we're seeing that being reflected in the Bow. And so the idea of this Australian company extracting coal from our mountains, their bigger concern is the water, and the farmers wanting that water for their fields, the ranchers wanting it for their cows, the beer producers wanting it for their beer, and the Indigenous being like, yeah, let's not do that because that's probably the wrong decision to make. I should say this, actually. Our mountains, our Rocky Mountains, we actually consider them our grandfathers. So I know for a lot of Canadians and Americans that may be hard to understand, but there's nothing on this earth that we don't consider sacred, even a rock. And when you have these beautiful mountains, we consider them our grandfathers. And we have stories that go back thousands of years about the mountains. So for a Canadian, or in this case, Australian company, to come in and rip down a mountain in order to steal all the coal, like, it's bigger than just a profit sharing, a loss of resource, dirtying the water. It's also like literally defacing the earth and defacing our grandfathers. And so like Mount Rushmore there's this carving of these four figureheads. And for a lot of the Indigenous people of that area, they are so insulted because those were beautiful grandfathers long before they were ever carved. And they had stories about those sacred mountains. So that there is that bigger picture too of like, for us, we're caretakers of these lands. And the thing about settler colonialism is that they never care about the lands. They just, steal and rape and pillage. That's what they do of Mother Earth, and anything that's in their way, they'll just kill it. And I think that's really important to understand. There's a movie coming out right now called Killer Moonflowers, something like that. And it's a story that happened in the States of what was done to our Indigenous population. So I think it's really important to understand that there's hundreds of different nations across the states alone. And each one was directly impacted negatively by settler colonialism. And there's very different stories to all of them. And I'll just tell you up here in Fort McMurray. So I'm in Calgary. I was born here in Calgary. I've lived in Sylvan Lake and in Fort McMurray, and Fort McMurray for 2 years. And in Fort McMurray, they were really painting the Métis as squatters. That was the word they would use for them. Oh, they're just squatters, because they didn't have rights to the land according to colonial standards. But they did have rights to the land as Indigenous peoples. They had been there for a long time. So they were taken forcibly at gunpoint at the same time I lived up there, so 1981, and forced away from the lands so that it could be developed for the oil sands and tar sands. So that's why when you hear from Alberta, it's the most ethically sourced oil there is. Well, that's a lie, because there's never been an Indigenous community that has ever ethically been removed, ever. That's unheard of. And we were actually going to touch on this conversation of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. And I think it's really important for me to show you. We had a national inquiry, and this is the report that came from it, right? Like it's not little. And Siri and I and the rest of our book club actually went through it over the course of a year, doing sections of it, talking about how this works. So the understanding of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, it's a bigger picture of understanding settler colonialism. And what I find is that a lot of non-Indigenous just don't understand the gravity of what settler colonialism is. So, this one story that Hollywood decided to make and have the Martin Scorsese's and the Leonardo DiCaprio's and Robert De Niro actually do a story that's like one of hundreds of awful trauma and violence and genocide that Americans have done to the Native Americans in the States. And conversely, up north, the Canadians have done to the Indigenous peoples, right? And we have over 600 nations alone here. So it's really important to understand, this is violence. And the fact that a lot of people don't even know we exist is violence. The fact that there's the Washington Redskins and these awful mascots that actually use our terminology is dehumanizing. But that's done on purpose so that people feel good about stealing our land, our resources, and calling themselves Americans or Canadians. So I can get a little further into that, but I just wanted to make sure that as Americans, you're not alone. It is also other countries coming to Canada and having no problem killing in order to extract. And I should also say that Canadian mining companies that are head office here in Calgary, they're doing the same thing in a place like Brazil or Guatemala, right? We are not perfect by any means up here. We just have really poor laws that allow for that killing to happen wherever it is we've decided is of importance. So what can settler climate activists do to support Indigenous resistance? And I think it's really important to say this, is that there is a real problem of racism in the climate change world. So depending on where your understanding of what settler colonialism is can depend on how you really can help Indigenous people. White supremacy is really insidious. It is really evil, because where a lot of people think that it's wearing a big white hat and hanging people from trees, it's actually even deeper than that. It's the just not seeing someone as equal when you walk down the street. And I can tell you, Calgary has this stampede. It's we call it the greatest outdoor show on earth, and it's a big rodeo. So if I dress as a cowgirl, people are kind to me. They'll open doors, chat with me, look me in the eye. If I dress in my regalia, they won't even acknowledge I exist. They won't look me in the eye. They will not engage with me. They will not talk to me. I cannot wear my regalia on the public transit, because otherwise I will be harassed. So white supremacy, while people think it's just wearing white hats and burning people and burning crosses, it's bigger than that. It's much more insidious in the fact that, you as a teacher can go into a school and treat a Black student lesser than, or you can not look at an Indigenous person in the eye and treat them as the same as you would a white friend. It is that insidious. So that's why we talk a lot about anti-racism training and why it is so important for people who want to support Indigenous people to really start working on their anti-racism and their inherent biases. Because in the long run, you're not helping us if inherently you believe you are more superior. And that is white supremacy. And I know it is hard to believe that, and that might be something, I have, Native friends, I have Black friends, that can't possibly be me. But I really encourage you to deconstruct every ounce of it, because even for myself, someone who grew up watching Oprah, cheering for, the Chicago Bulls, thinking, oh no, I'm totally not racist. But when you start to unpack it, especially during Black Lives Matter, when you start to realize that maybe you don't treat your Black neighbors quite the same as you would a white one. You don't trust maybe a Black cop the same as you would trust a white cop. That is racism. That is that anti-Blackness coming through. And it's really important to dissect that, because I have to do it with everything. We were all raised in a white supremacist society, from our education system to our media moving forward. So I really encourage people to understand, as an Indigenous person, I usually tolerate people's racism. That anti-Indigenous bias is so painfully clear. It comes through from the start of a land acknowledgement to the end of a conversation based off the type of questions that I get asked. So I just, it has taken me a long time to get here. I also have to work on something called internalized racism, internalized oppression. I'm sure we have a good group of women here. You would experience that regularly as well, knowing that you have to work twice as hard as a man in order to get further. And it's like, that's actually not true. That is what that gendered bias is, right? Now add, of course, a different race, and it's just that much more. So I've really had to come to understand the reason why I don't get a fair shot in this world is simply because of this. Because I'm a woman and I'm Indigenous. And even when I had short, cute hair with little blonde frosting highlights, I still wasn't being treated the same. And because no matter how hard I try to hide being Native, I'm still Native. And I think that, like my white father, he has a hard time understanding that, because, he raised me. He raised me to speak like this, talk like this. And when I started to unpack really what racism was and his role in it, it hurt him. He doesn't like it. He'd rather me just not do that. And he comes from a family it's easy to let people cut them out of their life. So it's basically what he's done to me by just identifying as Indigenous. So imagine that, right? How can you support Indigenous people? Well, if you have, oh no, my God, I have a niece that's a Native. I've asked the non-racist auntie, and I say that sarcastically because she really was, what nation is your niece from? And they can't tell me. And I'm like, well, how are you honoring who they are if you can't even tell me what nation they're from? So, I know I upset and offend a lot of people by challenging them on their racism, their bias, but we're not going to help Indigenous people without learning more about them and listening to them and respecting their voice. So
Michelle,
I find
time is there time to ask one more question before our Q&A period? Okay, we have about 7 minutes until our Q&A period, and there was one more question in the description about the transition to renewable energy. Mm-hmm. So almost everyone here is very, very involved in the transition to renewable energy, and there's also concerns in terms of how settler colonial pitfalls can the word that I've heard out there is eco-colonialism. I'd love to hear your perspective on what you've seen and how we can help avoid the pitfalls and what to keep thinking about as we move in this transition.
Sure. So, for example, if you're talking about lithium or uranium, like first and foremost, like just as we did a land acknowledgement to acknowledge where we are, where is the land that we're extracting from? And who are the Indigenous people of that land? And are you taking from them with real proper consultation and consent? Usually not. Usually it's just done without. And the great thing about both the U.S. and Canadian legal systems, we, by their standard, they can say, "Oh, we totally consulted," by sending an email once. That's their idea of what consultation is, and so the legal system really supports extraction, genocide of Indigenous people. So being very aware of that, where it's like, what is the green energy you're looking for? And at what is the cost of it? So, for example, my people are really far up north. We have uranium by where we were, and we were the first people to extract it for the state. And because the state knew the health issues, but didn't tell us, we literally lost all our men. So it was all of our men died of cancers right away. So these are things that I think of, like I'm sure you've heard about blood diamonds. Same concept. I mean, it's just the stealing of a resource at the expense of the Indigenous people of that land, no matter where we're talking. So for me, it's really important to understand that that's what the issue is that, yeah, we can change to different sources of energy, but what is the cost to the Indigenous people that we're extracting that from? And why aren't we allowing them to have a voice in that? And why aren't we sharing resources with them? I know in the States, the casinos are a big thing, but that shouldn't be the default. And it's really insulting that it is, I think, just as an outsider looking in. So that bigger picture of making sure that we really do proper consultation and that we have equity sharing, because like from up here, I consider everybody a treaty partner, but being a treaty partner means you have responsibilities. And part of that is inclusion and equity and 50% of the decision making. And we've never had any of those things. So for me, every Canadian is a treaty breaker. Right, like that's where we start at, and their government, they always vote in people that are committed to Indigenous erasure. So, and we see that no matter which party system up here in Canada, we have three main parties instead of the two down south. So the Republicans are equal to our Conservatives, the Liberals are equal to the Democrats, and we have another group of people that are mainly for the workers. I think of your Bernie Sanders. So anyway, between all of them, they're always committed to genocide. So they're all for killing people in order to make money. So, these are the issues that we have to start realizing, is that even our governance that we choose is causing these problems. And I don't think that as Canadians and Americans, we've really had real meaningful discussions about that. So I hope that helps answers that really quickly.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yeah.
I wondered if this might be a good time for us to start our Q&A period. We were going to do breakout rooms, and they're going to be random breakout rooms for 5 minutes. And this will give folks a chance. That was a lot to listen to. Michelle calls these groups community care groups, which I appreciate. And this is just a chance. It'll be 5 minutes, groups of 3 or 4, to just kind of debrief a little bit and then think about what question you might ask in the Q&A period. And then the rest of the time will be Q&A. If you have a question, please send it directly to Siri. You can find her in the chat, and she's curating the questions and will help us with that. Kevin, are we ready for the breakout community care groups?
Heck yeah, here we go.
Welcome back, everyone. So if you have a question that you're inspired to ask, please send it to Siri and we will curate them. In the meantime, let's start with some that we have already. Does Canada have any major environmental organizations working on the tar sand situation?
Oh boy. The thing about settler colonialism is that at the end of the day, they just really perpetuate each other. So technically, we have a federal body and a provincial body that is supposed to be regulating that. But because of politics, really, they're really just green light approvals. We have a bill that was introduced, and the concept was to have more Indigenous consultation and equity sharing. And the Conservatives really took this as an anti-Alberta bill and to stop all production of everything. And it really was just an environmental protection bill. Under the previous Conservative government, so the Liberals have been in power for 8 years. And prior to that was a Conservative government. And they actually axed a ton of the environmental regulations that we did have. So the reason why the Liberals won 8 years ago was because they made all sorts of promises about reinstating environmental protectionism. And so they have this new bill that was even challenged by the province of Alberta in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually ruled in their favor that it was a constitutional jurisdiction nightmare and that it was overreached by the federal government to be meddling in the province's jurisdiction. So really, we don't have a lot of the environmental regulation that we should. That said, it is a huge process to go through both bodies. So when I was surveying wells and pipelines, we still had to do all the surveys through the provincial body. And that is where the regulatory process, they almost always greenlight every project. Don't get me wrong, there's no real standards there. So, but you just have to go through their system, their bureaucracy. And a lot of Canadians falsely think that that is somehow a mechanism of accountability, but it actually isn't. So here in Alberta, we have a ton of wells and pipelines that need to be reclaimed, and they're not being reclaimed right now. So technically, they are supposed to do it. If you follow me on Twitter, I retweet a lot of the folks that are in the know. Indigenous people have been saying this since we first started doing exploration here. But now that the white farmers are being impacted and are speaking up about it, now there seems to be a little more understanding that this is a big issue that needs to be dealt with. And because of the lack of reclamation that's really being done, both in the tar sands and the rest of the wells and pipelines that they do here in Alberta, there was a fellow named David Schindler. He was a doctor, and he was documenting over the last few decades the health effects on the Indigenous communities downstream from the tar sands. And they were doing everything they could at the provincial level to silence him. He just recently passed away, but from my point of view, he's just one of those heroes of my generation that will probably go unrecognized for his work of trying to raise awareness of the toxicity that was resulting from the tar sands. And I was going to say, I've been meaning to say, tar sands is a loaded term. In Alberta, a lot of people try to say oil sands. Tar sands was the original term that the industry used themselves. Then they tried to make it sound better by using oil sands. So a lot of times I just say the term bitumen, because that is the actual term for whether it's tar sands, oil sands, or whichever. But at any rate, the local Indigenous people said to not use that. They would use a little bit of it on their canoes, but for the most part, they just said, keep it in the ground. And then, of course, the settlers came and said, or we can make money. And that's what they've chosen to do. So I hope that answers that question to some extent. Okay. Yeah.
There was another part of this question that was about the NGO environmental organizations that are working on this issue in Canada.
Yeah, so there's a lot of nonprofit and a lot of businesses that are starting to do that work. So even my own husband, he's working for an energy company right now that's creating these generators and sheds that take the methane. So it's quite normal in Alberta. I'm 46. My entire life, people will just burn off flares regularly throughout Alberta to get rid of this excess. Is it methane? I want to say it's methane. And anyway, my husband's working on a project right now basically using that to help reduce emissions, so that way that energy gets used without just flares going off regularly. They usually try to do it at night when people aren't looking, or they'll do it during the day when people aren't around. And so what you see off of a road or road allowance, very different when you actually go in, a quarter acre area where they're doing this development. So it's worth a field trip, let me tell you. Although you have very similar problems down there. So I guess you don't have to go that far.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. There was another question asking about Canada's environmental regulatory structure. Our regulatory structure here in the US is through the EPA and the state EPAs. So maybe you could talk about that and its impact on these issues, as well as Indigenous resistance.
Yeah, so Canadian Natural Resources, they're the ones that I was kind of trying to allude earlier about how this C-69 has really become a wedge issue for politics to play with. But technically, the Canadian Natural Resources, that's CNRL is an actual company. There is a natural resources division of Canada, and that area is the one who's supposed to do the regulatory approvals. They're the ones that we're trying to modify to have more Indigenous accommodations. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen, not in my lifetime. Anyway, that is the organization. And then provincially, we have a regulatory body as well. So it was called the AEC, now AER, so the Alberta Energy Regulatory regulator, and we have to go through that process as we go through every project, and at every step of the way they have to be involved, and they pretty much just green lighted. But it is kind of like a tax system too, a little bit for on business as well. So that's how that works. Siri's put a nice link in there.
Okay, so the next question is about for people to some of your favorite Indigenous orgs, Indigenous run organizations that are working on these issues up in Canada.
Yeah. I think the most important thing for people to understand is a lot of the nations themselves will speak up. So for me, just like you would follow this organization, you would like them on Facebook, you would sign up for their emails, etc. If you care about the groups that are impacted by the tar sands, start by following those nations that are downstream from them, because you'll see the Fort Chippewa. There's a few nations. There's a Cree Nation up there that the name eludes me right at this exact second, but there's a lot of nations that you could follow them on Facebook. You could sign up for their emails so that you can have an understanding of what's happening. So a non-government Indian organization that I really like are Keepers of the Water. I think that they do some really good work of trying to raise the alarm of what's happening. The Niitsitapi water protectors are the ones that are really focused on this Australian coal extraction issue, and even the country singers are working with them to try to raise awareness about this. It was denied before the election, but now that the election is over, they're submitting an application to develop that. So that's kind of gone through under the nose of a lot of Albertans, all of the ones that were trying to raise awareness before the election and before it was disapproved. For some reason, they just quit paying attention, I guess. So the Niitsitapi water protectors, Keepers of the Waters, those are the two that I really follow here in Alberta. There's some really great organizations trying to do that work, like First Peoples Law. They try to talk about it from a legal standpoint. The Indigenous Bar Association tries to raise awareness on Indigenous issues from a legal standpoint as well. So there's quite a few organizations that are Indigenous owned or Indigenous ran. So that's a real issue up here in Canada, is having settlers run boards for Indigenous people. It's just another form of colonialism. So unless Indigenous people are in charge of the organization, I generally don't support it because, at the end of the day, it's just another form of colonialism. Even if people are well-meaning, at the end of the day, if they're non-Indigenous, they don't understand our issues. So, and I know Siri's been putting together a few of the groups that we talked about prior to this meeting, Beaver Lake, Cree Nation, the Raven Trust. She actually brought that up. I'm like, yes, Raven Trust is a really great group. So Melina Lubican Massimo from the Lubican Cree, she is a wonderful person to follow. Unfortunately, she's a family member of the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. That's a really sad story to follow, but it's really important to understand that all extraction brings in man camps, and these man camps rape and pillage. That's literally what their job is to do. So they have no problem doing that to the women that are close by. Mikisew Cree Nation. I kept forgetting that one. Adam Allen is quite famous from Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. He tries to raise awareness on all sorts of things. The Lubican First Nation, they actually were the only ones that protested the 1988 Winter Olympics here in Calgary to try to bring awareness to what was happening. And I think it was Adam Allen was the one who actually approached James Cameron to say, your show Avatar is our real life. That's what's really happening to us. And took him on a tour up there of the tar sands so that he could see that that's a real life. I've never watched the movies because it is too close to home for me. So while a lot of people might think blue people are, but it's a way to dehumanize them, right? To not see them as people. So that's why that was part of why I never wanted to watch it too, is because there was no humanity in it, of course, much like everything else we do. So yeah, those are some good organizations. I can probably talk a lot further though about how it's just important to listen to Indigenous voices. So there's some news organizations up here that I highly recommend. There's one called Aboriginal Television Network, so APTN. We always, follow what's going on there because they tell it from an Indigenous point of view as opposed to the settler colonial point of view. But when you tell the story from an Indigenous point of view, it's a completely different news story. So I highly recommend APTN. I have one here locally called Wind Speaker. They try to do some really good work too as Indigenous journalists. And, I really appreciate you plugging my social media. My podcast is Native Calgarian, but there are many other Indigenous podcasts as well. And, a lot of them try to have a lot more fun than I do. I'm so damn serious all the time. So it might be more fun to kind of listen to some other Indigenous voices as well, just to get some balance as to what's happening. And especially if it's the nation that's being directly impacted and directly affected. So I really appreciate that as well. We have CBC Indigenous as well, which is better. My daughter was actually published on CBC Kids. So, they try to let Indigenous lead once in a while, but you can really see the difference in a lot of the news articles. We had one of my Indigenous sisters here. Her kid got bullied, and it was a non-Indigenous news reporter, and he thought he was being fair and balanced, but he never gave any, history of settler colonialism in any of the article of why it is that oppression and racism is magnified when you're Indigenous to a white teacher. But, I don't really think between Canadians and Americans that we're having those types of conversations of oppression dynamics and settler colonial understanding when it comes to Indigenous issues. So, while he felt that there were Indigenous slurs being said, for some reason, amazingly, when you have a white supremacist settler mentality, you can't hear that same racism. So these are the issues that I face for sure. Yeah, I hope that answers some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. In our last couple minutes, could you say a little bit more about your book club? I understand that another series. How do we join? When is enrollment still open, etc.?
Yeah, it is available to anybody who wants to join us. It's just a Zoom link. It used to be in person, but then when COVID happened was when we switched to online. And then because I got used to Zoom and how to record on Zoom, then I could even start uploading it to my podcast. So it worked out really nice for us to continue through Zoom. And then because we did, Siri was able to join us as well. So it really is open to anybody with a Zoom account. It's the second Monday of a month at 6:30 Mountain Time. So if you can make that work into your schedule, like I'd love to have you. And the other part is that if you miss it, for the most part, we do record it and then put it up onto the public domain for everybody to see and hear. So Siri actually is one of those folks that we try to really respect their boundaries and have the recording paused so that they can speak without fear of repercussion and such. So we try to create a really safe space for people, and Indigenous people speak first, so that way, because non-Indigenous voices have always led these conversations. So it's important to hear Indigenous voices first. And, and then, maybe if it's a topic, Two-Spirit, of course, they would speak first, and just making sure that we understand those oppression dynamics and respect that as we go through. So that's a little bit about that. Locally, I always encourage people to do, once they know better, to do better. So we have a reconciliation action group as well. And a lot of the folks who are part of our book club then ended up being a part of the reconciliation action group for, actual action. So for example, mascots in schools, those are things that our group will help settler kids who are like, this is racist. It's like, yeah, it's racist, but it's the adults in the institution that don't want it to change. So we'll help support those kids who are willing to do that work and their parents.
So that last thing, the Reconciliation Action Group, is that also on your website? We can get information about?
No, it's just it's its own entity. So actually, I just encourage anyone to start their own reconciliation committee. And that's what I really say on my podcast a lot too. So like your group, obviously trying to do good climate change action. I think it's imperative that you work with your local Indigenous communities on what climate change is to them and amplify their voice. So that's what I would encourage.
Okay, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Michelle, for taking the time, for chatting with us. Thank you, everyone who participated. If you would like to get more involved in our Indigenous Voices project, please reach out to me and Siri and to our climate justice team.